arms towards the sun. You feel the warmth of the rays, and then you know you're alive, and you don't have to be afraid of anything, 'cause you know the truth, and the truth is love, yes it is. Wasn't what they said to you or anything that you...
Welcome to the Bassline, everyone. Dr. Meryl Nass is one of the right docs of history. She has been persecuted by the state of Maine for fulfilling her oath as a doctor and not going along with the sketchy, incoherent narrative of the public health authorities. She has also been at the forefront of warning about the dangerous implications of the WHO pandemic treaty. It is my tremendous honor to welcome back to the Bassline the brilliant and courageous Dr. Meryl Nass. How are you this afternoon, Dr. Nass?
Oh, I'm great. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing very well, thank you. First of all, everyone, thank you for tuning in. Please tell a friend this program is live. prn.live, of course, is how you can tune in online. And we would love to add to our already considerable audience of very astute listeners and observers. And of course, you can support this program by going to my website, jeremiahhosea.com. Please buy the theme song of this show for $1. Please go to my Substack. Please become a subscriber. If you can afford to be a paid subscriber, that's incredible. If you can't afford it, please subscribe for free. And of course, I'm also a chess instructor. So one of the best ways to support this program is contacting me through my other website, remotelearningchess.com. You, of course, get a Bassline discount. There have been some great listeners of this program who have taken me up on the challenge, and they've sponsored chess lessons for young people and their families. And believe me, it's worth your time. Chess is proven to activate the brain, and the philosophical value, the acumen that is induced by the game is considerable. So please support this program by any of those means. And of course, I'm actually not just asking for a cash donation. I'm asking to work, basically. Hire me to do what I do, I guess with the exception of the music, but I did invest in the production of that music, paid phenomenal independent musicians to appear in the studio, and it's pretty well produced stuff, I think. So please check out jeremiahhosea.com, Jeremiah Hosea at Substack, and remotelearningchess.com. So all that being said, let's jump into this discussion here today. And first of all, Dr. Nass, I know that you had really been treated unfairly by the state of Maine, the medical board there. I know that there were some unfavorable verdicts against you that seemed just completely outrageous from my point of view. But before we tap into your vast knowledge about various other subjects, I'd love to hear an update from you in terms of, have you had any recourse in regard to that legal situation?
So, yes. So the Board of Medicine in Maine held hearings against me for speaking my mind about the problems with the COVID vaccine and treating patients with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. After they did that, they realized, one of their three lawyers finally realized that if they went to court with me on those charges, that they would lose, because those two drugs were fully licensed, and it's perfectly within my right and the patient's rights to have those medications. And the other thing was that the First Amendment allows me to say whatever I want in my private life. And basically, even in my professional life, because I can't say things that are incorrect to patients. I can't lie to patients, but of course I didn't. So once we got into a trial hearing, they changed the things that they were accusing me of. They changed them several times in the middle of the process, and then found me guilty of some funny little things that were not part of the issue in the beginning of the case. So they didn't like the way I kept my records, although I had everything, according to their own witness, I had everything that was necessary in the records. They said they didn't like my telemedicine rules because I didn't have the patient sign an informed consent, even though I don't believe that's necessary, and the governor had suspended those telemedicine rules. Some other piddly little things. None of the patients complained about my care, but the board claimed I was incompetent and took away my medical license. And then the next day, I was in the national news. So they were looking for a poster child, and I was it for that at that time. This was 3 years ago. And the process started 3 years ago, and it ended about a year ago. And we appealed the decision, and we are now in the appeals process. So we've all filed all the documents. We've had the oral arguments, and now we're just waiting for a decision by the judge. And we also filed a lawsuit against the board for a malicious prosecution because, as I said, nothing I did was actually against any rules, regulations, or laws. And their job is to prevent doctors who are incompetent or impaired from practicing in Maine. And so they implied that I was impaired. They implied because there is a statute that limits. So the board is only allowed to immediately suspend a license if they expect that if they suspect I'm a substance abuser, I'm crazy, or I'm demented. Or some other things, but I didn't have any of those things. So they went with the crazy, substance abuse, demented part of the statute. And of course, nobody had ever made a complaint that I was any of those things. There was no evidence to that effect. They wanted me to go see their own psychologist so that they could pin a diagnosis on me. But we filed a lawsuit against them, and so I never went to the psychologist, and they never pushed it because there was no real cause. And anyway, that's where we are now, and I'm hoping that I will be, my name will be cleansed of this, because they basically accused me of being a substance abuser, demented, or crazy. That put a black mark on my record in a national database that can never be expunged. Wow. So they've harmed me in that way, as well as forcing me to close my office, fire my staff, and anyway, we'll see what happens. I'm hopeful that maybe I will get the right decision. I think the evidence is clear, but we know that during COVID, a lot of judges favored the government and did not. They threw out cases without looking at the evidence. In my case, now that we're at the appeal stage, the judge is looking at the evidence, and so I'm hopeful.
Well, thanks for the update about that, and I'm really sorry for all that you've been subjected to. It's really terrible, and I really encourage people to really look into this case and other similar cases because it's a very important aspect of the historic record in terms of everything that transpired here. The attack against the doctors who were absolutely doing the right thing, and those accusations against you they seem to me to be out of Kafka for such a rational person such as yourself to be accused of such things with no basis for it. It's Kafkaesque. You were the first person, Dr. Nass, to make me aware of the dangers of this WHO pandemic treaty, and I know that you were very much at the forefront of educating people about that. I tuned into various Twitter spaces that you were featured on with Dr. Kat Lindley and others, and you were really doing an incredible job of making people aware of something that was receiving no publicity but was loaded with implications. It seems, the last I heard, that treaty was not ratified, that it was sort of, I don't know how you would characterize it.
Sure, let me jump in.
Yeah.
So basically, the World Health Organization was formed in the United States, in San Francisco, in 1946. Its constitution went into effect in 1948 as an agency of the UN designed to improve the public health of the world. There's really not much evidence that it has done a lot to improve public health worldwide, but it does have some tuberculosis and malaria programs and a few other programs for rare diseases that are helpful. In the meantime, it has basically been taken over by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, by other foundations, wealthy individuals, and 85% of the World Health Organization budget comes from donations rather than dues of its 194 member nations. As a result, the entities, particularly Bill and Melinda Gates, who was often, if you add up all the Gates Foundation entities, so there are two other foundations that Gates initiated. One is called CEPI and one is called Gavi. Both are involved with getting vaccines to underdeveloped nations. If you add their donations to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation donations, then Gates is really the number one funder of the World Health Organization. Okay, so as a result of this, the program of the organization has changed to suit its donors rather than the nation states. So the nations have some say, but limited because, as I said, 85% of the money comes from donors and is earmarked for specific purposes. Now, given that this organization is now essentially owned by its donors, it became an ideal place to try to work towards centralizing governance. So some of the organizations, like the Rockefeller Foundation, that is another donor, are well known to have been seeking a basic mechanism by which all the nations can be governed together on certain issues. So they've been trying to create structures outside of our normal governments, and in some cases, like the European Union, inside normal governance, to accomplish that. And so the UN system is, so it's not only the World Health Organization, but the UN as well, and its agencies that have been used to try to impose rules on the nation states through these organizations. And they're not hiding it anymore. So they, instead of saying government, they use the term governance, NANCE. But that means government. So that as a result, so COVID was used basically as an excuse or a justification for creating lots of public health rules and institutions that could be managed by the World Health Organization, which would then be able to give nations orders about what to do whenever the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern. And so in order to do this, two documents were created, a pandemic treaty and massive amendments to an existing thing called the International Health Regulations that almost no one knew about and was involved with maritime health issues. So if a ship leaves one country and then when it arrives in another, people on board or animals on board have an illness, then the World Health Organization has issued rules for how that situation should be handled. So what was done, and the United States was really very central in this process, and was back 3 years ago, or even a little longer. The United States said, "Look, we need a pandemic treaty so that nations can share information better and deal with pandemics better. We're going to see more pandemics." And so all the nations should get together and come up with ideas for what this treaty should look like and what amendments to the international health regulations should look like. And then we'll put it all together and we'll create documents so that the world can manage infectious diseases better in future. And of course, what happened is that there's a bureaucracy within the WHO, and so they collect lots of ideas, over 300 ideas from the nations, and then the ones they don't like, they just throw away, and the ones that their donors and the United States and the UK and the EU like get put up there as major parts of the platform. And what was created And then we had drafts of these documents. So we were seeing various drafts of the documents over the last 2.5 years. What was created was that the WHO would manage a program called the Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing System, where all the nations were supposed to go out and check out their bats and their other wild animals and find viruses that could potentially in the future cause a pandemic, capture them, and then send them to the WHO and also decode their genomes, do sequencing. This was a very peculiar part of this. Is nations in the middle of Africa have very little infrastructure, scientific infrastructure. We're suddenly being told by the WHO they need to develop sequencing laboratories and be able to sequence these viruses that they collect. Well, that makes you wonder: are they really interested? Because they can be sequenced in Geneva or in, New York or Frederick, Maryland. They don't need, once you've collected the virus, they can be sequenced anywhere. So you wonder, were they trying to develop a sequencing infrastructure so that human genomes could also be sequenced once the infrastructure was in place? There was the ability for the head of the World Health Organization to declare a public health emergency whenever he wanted, or he could declare the potential for a public health emergency. And once he made this declaration with no standards, there were no rules in these documents about what it would take to make this declaration. He could make it any time he wanted. He could call a climate emergency or a gun emergency. Anything, or a meat emergency. There are too many people dying of heart attacks and it's due to cows, or cow belches are causing the climate to get warmer, and so we have to get rid of cows. And then he would also be able to tell nations what they had to do about the emergency he just declared and what they weren't allowed to do. So, for example, in various versions of the treaty, he could tell nations that they cannot use medications. For example, hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, if there's another, coronavirus pandemic. So these were rather, this was giving these documents, had they been approved, would have given the World Health Organization enormous powers over the rest of the world. Now, some people say, well, they already had those powers. They were already telling nations what to do during the COVID pandemic, and our nations obeyed. And how one answers that is that the WHO actually did not have the power to coerce nations to obey, but many of them did anyway, because whoever is in control of our nations told them they needed to obey, but legally they didn't have to. Had these documents been approved, they would have had to obey in future. So there was a lot more to it, but that gives you some idea. Also, there was an extreme focus on vaccines. They wanted the ability to develop vaccines in a very short time period, and they didn't want to have to license them because licensing requires clinical trials and a process to assure that they are reasonably safe and reasonably effective. And they didn't want to have to go through that because that usually takes years. It took almost 1 year for the Pfizer vaccine in 2020, and they wanted to be able to finish that process in 3 or 4 months out at the outside. Now, the only way you can do that, the only way you can roll out a vaccine or a drug without fully testing it is if there's no liability for the manufacturer, because the manufacturer is not going to take the risk. Okay, here's my vaccine. I made it to your specifications, but I don't know if it's safe. I don't know if it's going to kill people, and I certainly don't want to be sued. So you're going to have to take away liability. So drafts of this pandemic treaty were designed to remove liability from manufacturers who would produce these products rapidly. Right. Now, the thing is, vaccines are a really bad answer to pandemics. Drugs are a good answer because it takes too long to make a vaccine. You have to make a vaccine to the specific virus that's going around. And furthermore, not only does it take a long time to do that and test it, but the virus may be one that mutates rapidly, in which case you have to keep changing the formulation. Whereas with drugs, you don't have to do that. You know, you may already have all these drugs that have been. Let me give you an example. After SARS-1, so there was a SARS epidemic in China. There were some cases in Canada and in Southeast Asia. The United States didn't suffer from this in 2002 and 2003. And then it all evaporated after about 8 or 10 months. But there were a total of 8,000 cases, and about 10% of them died. So it was a more severe illness than COVID, but it was limited. It wasn't as infectious. Now, it turned out afterwards, when the United States government and some other countries tested drugs to see whether we had any drugs that would have worked for that SARS-1, the United States NIH found out we had 66 different drugs that either worked against SARS-1 or worked against a cousin of SARS-1 called Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, or MERS, MERS, which is another coronavirus that is killing people mostly in Saudi Arabia and is transmitted through camels. So anyway, when they tested the SARS-1 from China and MERS from Saudi Arabia, they had 66 different drugs that killed one or the other of these coronaviruses. Already licensed, already developed. Their safety is already known. So obviously what you want to do is use the drugs that already exist, but almost all of them are generic. So nobody is going to make a bundle of money on them. You can't charge a lot of money. If the patent has expired, anyone can just go make it, and you don't have to pay royalties. And so it's cheap. Whereas if you have something like remdesivir, where it costs about $3,000 for a 5-day course, a lot of people are making money. Or if you make a new vaccine like Pfizer did, you can make, you can sell it for hundreds of billions of dollars. So clearly the money people they wanted the new vaccines or potentially new drugs, but even new drugs take a long time. What we really want to do is use old drugs, and we know that there's probably going to be plenty of old drugs that are going to work because they found 66 drugs that could in tissue culture, kill these coronaviruses, deadly coronaviruses. Anyway, that was what the WHO was trying to do. It was obvious, and let me point out that when the WHO was going to collect basically a library of potential pandemic pathogens, that means viruses and bacteria and fungi that could potentially cause a pandemic. These are called, when you're not using euphemisms, they're called biological warfare agents. So the WHO is going to have a library of biological warfare agents from around the world, and then they were going to share them with universities, research centers, pharmaceutical companies, and whenever a pharmaceutical company came up with a product for one of these deadly microorganisms, royalties essentially would be given to the nation that had supplied the biological warfare agent to the WHO. So that was the plan, called the PABS plan. Well, I have a history in biological warfare, and so I knew this was actually illegal. We have a treaty called the Biological Weapons Convention, which went into force in 1975, and says you're not allowed to proliferate biological warfare agents. You can't just send them to the WHO and have the WHO send them out to entities it thinks are suitable. That is just not allowed. In fact, within domestic law, the CDC has listed about 60 different microorganisms that if you're studying those microorganisms, which require high containment labs, you're not even allowed to transfer them to another university. You have to get permission from the CDC to make any transfers. So this whole WHO plan was going to turn all of that on its head and just basically proliferate biological warfare agents all over. And I had a sneaking suspicion that the purpose was, when a pandemic starts with one of these agents, you're never going to know where it got released or who released it, because it's going to have been proliferated all over the world, and labs everywhere are going to have it. So you'll never be able to find the culprit.
Right.
In any event, I made these points, and I worked with a number of other organizations around the world. I spoke in parliaments in 8 different countries. I met with many Congress members in the United States and pointed out that this was what the WHO was trying to do, and that the Biden administration backed it 100%, and yet the whole thing was a terrible idea, and we needed to fight it. And so, luckily, we were very successful. I think shining a light on these bad policies led to everyone who looked into it said this is a terrible idea. So we had 49 U.S. senators, all the Republicans, last year, 26 governors, all Republicans, and 22 attorneys general, Republicans, came out and said we are not going to, if the U.S. government goes along with this plan, we're not going to allow any jurisdiction of the World Health Organization within our states. Mm-hmm. And the senators said we don't want this to go forward. We want the United States to pull out of the negotiations. But if it doesn't, we want these treaties to be put before the Senate for ratification. Because it turns out that we thought all treaties went before the Senate for ratification, but only a small fraction, only 2 or 3% do. And so the federal government Biden administration was planning to just sign these treaties and they'd be law, basically. But the senators weren't going to go along with that. Now, of course, that we have a Republican majority in the Senate, they would not go along with it. So this all happened in May of last. Oh, we also had 2 states. We worked with 2 states, and they passed laws saying they would not allow the WHO or the UN or the World Economic Forum to come into their states and give it orders on how to conduct public health. So this was sort of massive, because the United States leads the world. We are, apart from Bill Gates, would be the number 2 supporter of the World Health Organization. And so the World Health Organization was unable to get agreement about the pandemic treaty and the international health regulations, which were to be voted on the last few days of last May. And finally, they kept rewriting the health regulations at the last minute, and they finally got a very watered-down version through, which didn't have any of the things I'm telling you about in it. Although it allowed the World Health Organization director to declare pandemics, but didn't give him any powers to manage them. So that got passed in May, but they were not able to get any agreement on the pandemic treaty. And the WHO has been working feverishly since then to try to get agreement before President Trump took office. And so they added lots of extra meetings. They still couldn't do it. So the pandemic treaty right now is still in negotiations, but with the U.S. saying we're pulling out of the World Health Organization. And there's a bill that was introduced today in Italy's parliament to pull Italy out of the World Health Organization. I think the the message is very clear that the nations are not going to go along with this. We are not turning over sovereignty for public health to the World Health Organization. And furthermore, this whole process has exposed the UN system as being under the control of elites who are trying to use it to gain much more power and control over the nation states of the world.
Well, that's a perfect lead-in to my next question, which is to what extent is the United Nations really the fundamental problem here? I've heard the suggestion that the WHO is sort of just an ornamental problem relative to the more deep-seated problem, which is the power and influence of the UN. What are your thoughts about that?
Both of these organizations are mainly paid for by donors, and they are both owned by donors. So the United Nations has been, at the same time as the WHO was trying to push forward with this plan, the United Nations had a similar plan where it could declare emergencies of any kind, public health emergencies, but also supply chain emergencies, cyber emergencies. If someone cuts off the electricity, that kind of an emergency, emergencies in outer space. Basically, they were trying to give themselves, the Secretary General, the power to declare any emergency that involved more than one nation. That could be declared by the Secretary General, and then he would be able to tell nations what they had to do about it. So it was a similar plan. They created a program for the future. I've forgotten the exact name. And we're trying to work on, again, documents like a treaty that would be adopted in September by the 193 members of the UN. What they finally came up with, because the nation states had already figured out what was going on with the World Health Organization and didn't want to give the UN great powers, what they came up with was a funny document which wasn't written like a treaty, and yet some of the language in it was treaty language, such as, nations shall do X, Y, Z. And most of it was very fluffy and vague, but some of it was specific. And so let me also say that the UN and its agencies don't like to take votes. They don't like, and the nations, the diplomats, they don't want to be held to their vote either, because a lot of them have been paid off. And so nobody wants you, the public, to know how your own diplomats or the diplomats of any other country are voting on big issues like this. So instead of a vote, they have something like they call a silence procedure, and a nation it can break consensus, but there is great effort made to stop nations from breaking consensus. Even nations that say, I'm not going along with this. For instance, Slovakia had said that publicly before the WHO meeting. We're not going along with this. And Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, flew to Slovakia to say, well, okay, you're not going along with it, but promise me you won't break consensus. And so this is what they do. And so they try to make it look like they have consensus for all the decisions. So they wound up getting a consensus on this program for the future at the UN. But it's very questionable whether whether it gave the UN legal authority to control nations or not, particularly because nobody signed it. So now it has to go to nations, and maybe they'll ratify it, or maybe they will create another document that is more specific about what powers the UN actually has. But as I said, I don't think the nations are going to go along with giving the UN powers over them, because now they really, the public understand. So in many cases, as we know, the heads of state are being controlled. I mean, we know that many heads of state were World Economic Forum young global leaders and have been trained by Klaus Schwab and his group to basically obey the World Economic Forum. Chrystia Freeland in Canada, who was the number 2 person after Justin, was a young global leader, and Justin was a young global leader, and she is on the board of trustees of the World Economic Forum. So she has pledged to to basically push forward the plans of the World Economic Forum in Canada. She just resigned her position, although she's still a member of Parliament, because she did not agree with Justin Trudeau about certain economic measures. But anyway, my point is that we don't know who these people are, who are and what their allegiance is, and they, whether it's Canada or whether it was the Biden administration, or many of the leaders of European nations, the leaders of Australia and New Zealand, and the UK, many of them have been young global leaders, and were not working for their own nations. So, so what their nation did at the UN had nothing to do with the national interest. Now, whether that continues, I mean, Trump has been incredible. I mean, the election of Trump showed that the people don't want to go along with this anymore. We're fed up. And Trump understands this. He's not interested in giving away sovereignty. He's not a young global leader. And the United States, I mean, we have the number one economy, although China is getting very, very close to ours. But we have a lot of influence in the world. And if the United States leaves certainly if we're planning to leave the WHO, but we may leave the UN system. That's a bit of a bigger stretch. That we only had one treaty or two treaties with the WHO, but we have lots of treaties with the United Nations. It would be a complex thing to leave. But it may happen. Or perhaps now that everyone is aware of how these institutions are being used to sort of globalize control of the world, maybe the institutions will change. Who knows? But I think we would be better off because there's so much inherent nepotism and corruption within the UN and the World Health Organization, simply, based on history and based on the way they were set up, and the appointment system. There's just who gets appointed to roles, what happens in these, I don't know. Sorry, I'm blathering.
Well,
but
no,
anyway,
I mean, you said the magic word, nepotism.
Nepotism and corruption.
And corruption, right.
So these are not, and the people who work at these institutions, as well as the diplomats, have all diplomatic immunity. So they can commit crimes and not be charged.
How convenient.
Accused of crimes. So the whole system probably needs to be completely redone, and my preference is to get rid of these organizations, let them, wither away very quickly, and create new ones as we need them.
Sounds good to me, for sure. On this program, of course, we've been keeping track of the harm inflicted by the COVID injections. I've had the honor, but the unpleasant honor, of interviewing a number of vaccine-injured individuals, some of which were nurses. Every story, of course, is different. Everybody's physical symptoms are different, but we've had on this program on several occasions now firsthand accounts of people who were perfectly healthy, even have a bill of health that was confirmed on record and that as being perfectly healthy, and then they received these shots, and in short order, their health was just destroyed. I mean, in ways that just sounds unusual in terms of people suffering from multiple diseases simultaneously, organ failure, different organs simultaneously. And bear in mind, and people who have listened to this program know, I objected to these shots just based on the concept of bodily autonomy in the first place. I was not a so-called anti-vaxxer, but I've become more and more of an anti-vaxxer as a result of this experience. And as far as the COVID shots themselves go, I had no idea that they would be so harmful. But I'm convinced, based on what I've seen and what I've heard, including these interviews of vaccine-injured individuals, that these are extremely dangerous and toxic products. What's your take at this point, several years in, that we've gathered information about what mRNA does to people, the COVID so-called vaccines? What's your up-to-date opinion of those products that were foisted upon us?
So I hate to talk about vaccines in general because it's as if you're talking about drugs in general. Are you against drugs?
Right.
Well, of course, we're not against all drugs. Okay. So and every vaccine is made totally differently than every other. So we have to think of them individually. At the same time, we also have to look at our public health agencies that are charged with regulating these products, drugs and vaccines, and food and cosmetics. And what we find is that they have been not only asleep at the switch, which they were, but more than that, they have been pushing out lies about these products. And they have made sure to study them in ways that would not identify the problems. They have covered up information, et cetera. So these public health agencies have actually been working against the public health regarding the COVID vaccines. Now, I did not think they were working against the public health on other products, but now, looking back, you say, well, how long has this been going on where they are not only not doing what they're charged to do, what their mission is, but actually quite the contrary. They're doing the opposite and telling us to take products that are harmful and lying about their efficacy as well as their safety and the quality of the manufacturing, because that's also one of their responsibilities, is to inspect the manufacturers and make sure that the product in the bottle is in fact what is on the label, and nothing else, no extraneous materials are in it, and that it's been produced according to very specific specifications. So I became interested in vaccines 27 years ago when the anthrax vaccine was discussed as something that would be given to 2.5 million members of the military. And I was at that point an anthrax expert, and I knew something about the anthrax vaccine, and I knew that it had not its safety and its efficacy had never been proven. In fact, when it was licensed in 1970, so the FDA wasn't even licensing vaccines back in 1970. It was done at a little agency in the NIH that felt that the vaccine industry was a delicate industry that needed a lot of care and support, and so they weren't really interested in doing anything that would harm the industry, and they waved through a license for anthrax vaccine in 1970 without an efficacy trial. So they didn't know if it would actually work against inhalation anthrax, and they told the manufacturer, go out and do a study and give us the data, but we'll give you the license now. And the manufacturer never did the study. And then the regulatory authority for vaccines was transferred by Congress to the FDA in 1972 after this NIH group had messed up with the polio vaccines, and many of the polio vaccines caused polio, and the agency knew it. They knew that monkeys were getting polio from some of these vaccines, and they allowed them to be shipped out and given to humans anyway. So with those failures, vaccines were moved to FDA. FDA was supposed to go through and look at all the licenses and make sure that all the vaccines were in fact safe and effective. It did that for a lot of vaccines. Half the vaccines approximately were actually taken off the market at that point. But the anthrax vaccine stayed in limbo because it was a military vaccine. So FDA basically didn't regulate it, left it to, FDA had, a budget of maybe $10 billion a year, and DOD maybe, close to $1 trillion a year. So DOD is a big agency, and they could, the way things work in the federal government is the FDA do what they wanted. So they allowed the military to use the anthrax vaccine for many years without ever establishing its safety or efficacy. And then when they started giving it to a lot of soldiers, the problems became obvious. And that was first in the Gulf War in 1990, and then again in 1998 they decided to give it to everybody.
Yeah.
So I learned at that point, I became very involved with this, and we had a lot of congressional hearings, and members of Congress actually wrote a book on it called Unproven Force Protection. And I learned then how these agencies basically wouldn't do their job if some higher entity instructed them not to. So when the COVID vaccines came around, And then I saw subsequently on other vaccines that we had better vaccines and worse vaccines, and the agency was not telling the manufacturers to clean things up. That, for example, here's another one. The Heplisave vaccine was approved, I don't know, about 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago. And when they did the clinical trials, they found that people who were getting the Heplisave vaccine, as opposed to other hepatitis B vaccines, had 3 times as many heart attacks. And so they're going, maybe it causes heart attacks. But if we really want to get statistical significance and we really want to know for sure, we'd have to have a clinical trial of 50,000 people. And we can't ask the manufacturer to pay for a clinical trial of 50,000 people when our normal vaccine trials are only a couple thousand. So we won't do that. We'll just give them a license and we'll see if it causes heart attacks later. So now it's 8 or 9 years later and we still don't know. And the vaccine's still on the market.
Oh, terrible.
So anyway, for me, knowing all of these things, I'm a little now hesitant. Like, well, when do they do their job and when don't they do their job?
Yeah.
So when COVID came, I certainly did not expect, like you, I had no idea that it would be basically equally as dangerous as the early anthrax vaccines, which caused actually the same kinds of illnesses, a lot of blood clot disorders, autoimmune disorders, chronic fatigue syndrome, all of that. They're very similar, cognitive impairments.
Right.
And death and arrhythmias. So I wasn't expecting that from the COVID vaccines, but I was aware that they had not been properly tested. I was watching very closely during 2020 to see how they were testing them and what the data looked like. And it was apparent when they were first given an EUA, an emergency use authorization on December 11th of 2020, the Pfizer vaccine was given that. It was known that they only had 2 months worth of data, an average of 2 months of data after they'd given the shots to the people in the clinical trial. And of course, 2 months of data isn't enough. And I didn't realize that was they really had a plan, because after 2 months, the efficacy drops very quickly. So they can only show a little bit of efficacy for the first few months and then none. And FDA had a standard. They wanted 50% efficacy, and they could show that for 2 months. After that, there was, very little. And then by 6 months, basically there was no efficacy. And then after 6 months, there was negative efficacy, which meant that if you had been given this shot, you were more likely to get COVID than if you had never received any shot. So, any COVID shot. So That's what negative efficacy is. And unfortunately, we have demonstrated that now in multiple studies, that people who got the COVID vaccines are actually more susceptible to getting COVID than those who did not.
So amazing that hasn't gotten more publicity. I mean, how significant considering the way that these were introduced to the public. We are running out of time. We're down to the last 7 minutes of our program. If you'd like to join in the conversation, I think we have time for one call. We'd love to hear from you. The number, of course, is 888-874-4888. 888-874-4888. If you want to ask a question and talk to the legendary Dr. Meryl Nass, now is your chance. I think I heard the phone ring in the other room. In the meantime, while we're waiting to see if someone's on the line, could you just give us some quick pointers, Dr. Nass, in terms of for folks who are not lawyers, who aren't doctors, who see that what's going on is truly wrong, but they don't have the credentials to weigh in the way a credentialed individual such as yourself can? What can a so-called ordinary person do to try to help, to try to be involved in this atmosphere?
Well, the first thing to do is to call both your senators right now and tell them to vote in favor of Bobby Kennedy for the head of HHS, because he will end all of this nonsense at the FDA and the CDC. They will be required to tell the truth, to do proper studies, and they won't be allowed to license or to market any vaccines or drugs that are going to harm the American people. People will be given a choice. But they'll be given an honest choice, which they haven't been given so far, which means you're going to be told the benefits and the risks of every drug and vaccine product so that you can make the right decision about whether it works for you. I mean, there are some, for example, polio vaccine. Polio vaccine is really not necessary if you live in the United States. There have been only, maybe 5 cases of polio in the United States in the last 10 years, roughly. Because it doesn't circulate in the United States. If you leave the United States and move to a country or travel in a country where polio is rampant, and there's very, very few of those, Afghanistan, Pakistan, parts of Africa. If you do that, then probably you should have a polio vaccine. But if you're growing up in the United States where there's no polio, well, do you really need one?
Right.
It is not endemic. The chance of you coming into contact with polio in your life is virtually zero, one in 100 million. Whereas, maybe you should have a tetanus shot because tetanus is everywhere. And if you have a baby does not need a hepatitis B shot on the first day of birth because hepatitis B is transmitted through dirty needles and sexual intercourse.
Yeah.
Babies don't do either one. So there's no reason to vaccinate a baby unless the mother is positive for hepatitis B and transmits it to the baby. That baby should be vaccinated and should get hepatitis B immune globulin as well. But 99+% of babies don't have a mother with hepatitis B, and so it's not necessary for them, and it's potentially harmful. Why would you give a newborn baby when you don't even know how healthy that baby is?
Yeah.
Why would you give them a challenge, a significant immune challenge? It's a bad idea. So what we want to do is start providing people with honest, I'm saying we, maybe I shouldn't include myself, but I have worked with Bobby Kennedy in the past. I helped edit 3 of his books. I've co-authored articles with him, and so I do advise him at times. So when I say we, what I really mean is Mr. Kennedy will be doing these things, not me.
Absolutely.
But maybe I will be helping him.
I sure hope so. Yeah, I sure hope so. We actually have a number of callers all of a sudden, and we won't be able to get to all of them. Hopefully, maybe 2, but probably just 1. We have Noel on the line from Brooklyn. How are you, Noel? Always great to hear.
Yeah, fine, thank you. I would like to know how come when Bobby Kennedy was being questioned yesterday that he said these are peer-reviewed. This is not me saying this. The senator just completely ignored him. And why aren't people going to jail for these things? Thank you.
Oh, by the way, I meant to say Noel. I do have another friend named Noel, but that's Noel from Brooklyn. But yeah, thank you, Noel. Go ahead, Dr. Nass.
Thank you. I don't know. I posted on my Substack last night an article from the Mayo Clinic showing that different races do have different responses to vaccines. And this is probably why the CDC had a study 20 years ago, and they've covered it up for 20 years, showing that young boys who were given the MMR had 4 times as much autism and neurological deficits afterwards as white. So they probably should have been given a lower dose because the Mayo Clinic showed that the response to the rubella vaccine was, much stronger in black children than in white children. And they were particularly looking at Somalis in that particular study, but there are others. So your response depends on your age, your gender. Women respond more to vaccines than men, so they probably should get a lower dose. But we do the one-size-fits-all. And in fact, with the DPT vaccine, babies get a higher dose than adults. At 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 18 months, and age 5, they're getting higher doses of antigens in their DPT shot than a pregnant woman does, or someone who's going off to college and is getting another shot. Or when you go for your every 10-year tetanus shot, it's usually a DPT, and you're getting, as I said, smaller doses than a 2-month-old. So, these are standards that have been around for decades, and they need to be reviewed and made appropriate.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nass. I think we're just about out of time here. We had a few callers on the line, but please call again next week. Actually, no, not next week. Next week's going to be a pre-recorded episode, but please call back in a couple of weeks when we're back live in the studio. And thank you so much again, Dr. Nass, for joining us. Thanks for all that you do. And please stay in touch. We're very much in support of all of your tremendous efforts.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Have a beautiful weekend. Talk to you soon.